Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you're here with me today because you're in for a really shocking story. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and turn on your bell so you don't miss any more crime cases that I regularly prepare for you. Today, we're going to talk about a case that looked like a tragic accident on a hunting trip in Africa but was actually a cold-blooded, planned murder. A story of betrayal, infidelity, and greed that shocked America. On October 11, 2016, in a remote part of Zambia, an event took place that changed the lives of several families forever. Bianca Rudolph, a 60-year-old woman from Pittsburgh, was reportedly fatally injured in an unfortunate gun accident. Her husband Lawrence, whom everyone called Larry, claimed the shotgun accidentally discharged when his wife was packing it up before leaving the hunting farm. At first glance, it seemed like a terrible tragedy. A successful dentist lost his wife on an exotic vacation. But as it soon turned out, the truth was much darker. Behind the facade of a happy marriage were millions of dollars in insurance policies, years of infidelity, and an elaborate plan for murder. This case had it all: an exotic location, a luxurious lifestyle, a secret mistress, and an investigation that lasted over 5 years. The FBI had to work with Zambian authorities to uncover the truth, which was buried with Bianca Rudolph's ashes. So sit back, because today we're going to dive deep into one of the most intriguing criminal cases of recent years. Let's get to it. And now we come to the heart of the case, that fateful morning in the African wilderness. Brace yourselves, because the details I'm about to tell you are truly disturbing. We are on a luxury hunting farm in the middle of the Zambian wilderness. Imagine a spacious lodge that has been used as accommodation for wealthy hunters from all over the world. This lodge had everything you need: bedrooms, a bathroom, a living area. It was not a primitive hut, but a relatively comfortable facility in the heart of the African wilderness. Bianca and Larry spent a few days here on a hunting trip. It was their last day on the farm and they were getting ready to head to the airport to fly back to the United States. The atmosphere in the cabin was one of packing and preparing to leave. Luggage was being unpacked, things were being put into suitcases and bags. It was in these moments of preparation for departure that a tragic event was about to occur. The cottage was relatively small, so everything was taking place in a confined space where anyone would normally be able to hear and see what was going on. A 12-gauge shotgun, that's a really powerful weapon that's commonly used when hunting larger game. This particular shotgun was part of the hunting equipment used by the Rudolphs during their expedition. The shot hit Bianca right in the heart area. It was an instant fatal wound. You don't have to be a doctor to understand that such a wound to the chest caused by a 12-gauge shotgun is absolutely devastating. The force of the impact, the extent of the tissue damage, it all meant that Bianca didn't stand a chance. The position from which the shot was fired and the angle at which the projectile struck the victim were crucial. This was no long-range shot. The gun had to be in close proximity to Bianca. Forensic evidence later showed that the distance was indeed minimal. What's interesting, and here's where you have to watch out, the shotgun allegedly fired as it was being packed. According to Larry's version of events, it was an accident while handling the gun. But how exactly does a 12-gauge shotgun accidentally fire and hit someone right in the heart? That's a question that has been in the air from the very beginning. And now comes the part that's really problematic. Larry Rudolph had his version of what happened, and I have to say, that version had a lot of holes in it from the beginning. According to Larry, he was either in the bathroom or in the shower at the time of the shooting. His testimony differed on that point, which is a red flag in itself. He said he heard a loud gunshot that scared him. He immediately ran outside and found his wife lying on the ground with a horrific wound in her chest area. Larry said Bianca must have been handling the gun, perhaps pulling it out of its holster or packing it in some way when the gun accidentally discharged. He said it was pure coincidence, the kind of tragic bad luck that unfortunately happens when handling guns. He described how shocked he was, how he couldn't believe what had happened. He talked about how he tried to administer first aid, even though it was clear that the injury was fatal. His entire story was based on the fact that he was in another room, that he had not heard anything suspicious before the gunshot, and that when he ran in, it was too late. But here's the problem. If you're in a small cabin and someone is handling a shotgun in the next room, don't you hear it? You don't register sounds of preparation, movement, anything? And if the gun was secured, how could it have accidentally fired? And here we come to the absolutely key witness in this whole case. Spencer Kokoma was an employee of a hunting farm who was near the cabin at the critical moment. His testimony was crucial and completely undermined Larry's version of events. Spencer heard a gunshot and immediately ran to the lodge, knowing something had happened. When he arrived at the scene, he found a dramatic scene. Bianca on the ground with a horrific wound, and Larry. And here comes the most important part. Larry was fully clothed. He wasn't wet. He wasn't wearing a towel. He wasn't in a bathrobe. He was fully dressed in normal, everyday clothes. It was immediately suspicious to Spencer. If Larry was indeed in the shower or in the bathroom as he claimed, why was he fully clothed? How could he have run out so quickly and be completely dressed? Spencer also noticed Larry's behavior. He showed no signs of having just run out of the shower. His hair wasn't wet. There were no drops of water on his skin. His clothes weren't hastily thrown on. He looked like someone who had been dressed and ready for some time. This detail, the simple fact that Larry was fully dressed, became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Spencer Kokoma was not afraid to tell the truth, even if it meant going against the rich American tourist's version. His testimony was straightforward, consistent, and devastating to Larry's defense. Imagine the scene. An African morning, a hut in the middle of the wilderness, a loud shotgun blast, and when the first man runs to help, he finds the victim's husband fully clothed, even though he claimed he was in the shower. This is the moment when a tragic accident starts to become something much darker. Spencer also described how Larry reacted. He was not hysterical, as you might expect from someone who had just found his wife mortally wounded. His behavior, according to Spencer, was controlled. Almost too controlled for someone who'd just been through such a traumatic event. This eyewitness testimony, who arrived at the scene within moments of the shooting, was invaluable. Spencer had no reason to lie. He did not know the Rudolphs personally. He was simply a farm employee who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe the right place at the right time, because his testimony later helped uncover the truth. Now let's look at what followed in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy. Larry's actions in the hours and days following his wife's death were, let's say, unusual. Instead of insisting on a thorough investigation, instead of wanting the Zambian authorities to examine every detail of what happened to his wife, Larry pushed for something else entirely. Immediate cremation. Cremation. In Zambia, as quickly as possible. That was his number one priority. You have to understand, Bianca was Catholic. The Catholic faith traditionally prefers burial of the body, not cremation. For faithful Catholics, cremation is often seen as problematic, although the Church now allows it in certain circumstances. But Rudolph's family and friends of Bianca knew that she probably would have preferred a traditional Catholic burial with burial of the body. Larry ignored all that. He insisted on cremation and insisted it happen quickly. Very quickly. He argued that it was more practical, that the body decomposed quickly in the African climate, that it was logistically easier than transporting the body back to the United States. But here's the problem. Cremation destroys most forensic evidence. Once the body is cremated, there's no going back. You can't do an additional autopsy. You can't re-examine the wounds. You can't do more ballistics tests. All the physical evidence is gone forever. For someone who had just lost his wife under suspicious circumstances, the insistence on a quick cremation was odd, to say the least. Most people would want answers. They'd want to know exactly what happened. They'd want all possibilities explored. Larry didn't. Larry wanted cremation, and he wanted it now. Now let's take a look at how the initial investigation went, and how doubts began to accumulate that this was indeed just an unfortunate accident. Zambia Police. The Zambian authorities, of course, had to look into the case. When a foreign national dies in violent circumstances on their territory, they must carry out an investigation. But this is where the complications begin. The Zambian police had limited resources. It was not like the United States, where a team of forensic specialists with state-of-the-art technology would arrive on the scene. The hunting farm was in a remote area, far from major cities and their technical facilities. The local police did what they could with what they had available. They did a basic search of the crime scene, documented the position of the body, photographed the scene, confiscated the weapon. They interviewed Larry, who gave his version of events about the packing accident. They also interviewed farm employees, including a key witness who found Larry dressed. But here's the problem. Larry was a wealthy American tourist. He had money, he had influence, he had connections. In a country where corruption is unfortunately not unknown, wealth can have a significant impact on the course of an investigation. I'm not saying there was any bribery or manipulation, but the reality is that investigating a foreign tourist in a developing country has its own specifics. Zambian police officers also faced pressure. Larry insisted that the case be closed quickly. He claimed he needed to complete formalities and return home with his late wife, or rather, her ashtray urn. He wanted the case classified as an accident so he could move on. After several days of investigation, the Zambian police issued their statement. They classified Bianca Rudolph's death as an accident. They concluded that it was an unfortunate incident involving the handling of a weapon. No charges have been laid. The case has been closed. It was a green light for Larry. He could go on with his plans. But for many people who followed the case closely, it was unsettling. Too quick, too convenient a conclusion to a case with too many unanswered questions. Cremation over objections. And this is where Larry acted really fast. No sooner had the police classified the case as an accident than he was pushing for cremation. It was a priority he pursued with iron consistency. Cremation is not a common thing in Zambia. Most of the local population follow Christianity or traditional African religions where bodies are buried. Crematoria are not on every corner. But Larry found a way to make it happen.
More importantly, Larry carried out the cremation despite loud protests from people who knew Bianca. Her friends back home heard about the situation and immediately started calling, writing, trying to stop it. They said Bianca would never have wanted it, that it went against her faith, that the family needed time to make a decision about the funeral. Imagine the phone calls. Desperate friends trying to call Zambia, contact the authorities, contact Larry, begging him to wait, to give everyone time to deal with this, to respect Bianca's religious beliefs. Larry brushes all these objections off. He stood his ground. He argued practicality, hygiene, climate. He said that as a husband, he had the right to decide, that he knew what was best, that people should leave him alone in his grief. But to those who knew Bianca, it didn't seem like grief. It looked like a rush, like Larry was trying to hide something, to remove something forever before anyone could ask any more questions. The Catholic faith that Bianca had practiced all her life had specific rituals associated with death. Vigils, masses, funerals with the body present in the church for friends and family to say goodbye. All of which Larry denied. Instead, he arranged for cremation in Africa, thousands of miles from her home, from her friends, from her church community.
The cremation was quick. Bianca Rudolph's body was cremated before most of her loved ones knew what had happened. The ashes were given to Larry as he prepared to return to the United States. But it wasn't just Bianca's friends who had doubts. The U.S. consular officer in Zambia, who had been informed of the American citizen's death, also felt something was wrong. Consular officials have an important role to play when an American citizen dies abroad. They must ensure that all procedures are followed, that the family is notified, that all legal matters are handled. And in this case, the consular officer felt he should have done more. Before the cremation took place, and this is absolutely crucial, the consular officer or the doctor in charge of the consulate did the documentation of Bianca's injuries. He took photographs. He wrote down a detailed description of the wounds. He documented the location, size, and nature of the shotgun wounds. This decision was incredibly astute. Maybe the officer had a hunch. Maybe he was just following protocol. But whatever the reason, this documentation would later prove invaluable. The photographs showed the extent of the damage. They showed exactly where the projectile hit the body. They showed the angle of entry. They showed that the shot was fired at very close range. All these details were recorded before the body disappeared in the flames of the crematorium. The consulate also communicated with the Zambian police. They were exchanging information, coordinating action. The American official read the police reports and saw the testimony. He saw inconsistencies in Larry's testimony. He saw suspicious circumstances. He couldn't interfere with the Zambian investigation. That's not the role of the consulate. But he could document. He could have archived. He could have ensured that all the information was available for any future investigation. The consulate also communicated with the family in the U.S., informed them of the situation. He gave them basic information about what had happened and how the Zambian authorities were investigating the case. And when family and friends began to ask questions, the consulate recorded those questions. This documentation, photographs, reports, correspondence, all ended up in the archives. It was waiting there, ready for the day when someone would start asking the harder questions. The insurance claim. And then the money came. A huge amount of money. Larry Rudolph filed an insurance claim almost immediately upon his return to the United States. And the amounts were, well, let's just say they were very, very large. $4,800,000 US. That's an amount most people can only dream of. And that was the total amount that Larry got from the various life insurance policies that Bianca had. There were several policies. Some were older, taken out many years ago. Some were relatively new. They were with different insurance companies, but they all had one thing in common. Larry was the beneficiary. In the event of Bianca's death, he would get all the money, $4,800,000. Imagine that amount. That's not an insurance policy the average person would have. That's insurance on the level of very wealthy people. And Larry claimed all this money. Of course, the insurance companies had to investigate the case. When someone dies under dramatic circumstances in a foreign country and it's such a large sum of money, insurance companies look at it very carefully. Nobody wants to pay out millions of dollars if there's the slightest suspicion of fraud. But Larry had all his paperwork in order. He had a police report from Zambia classifying the death as an accident. He had a death certificate. He had all the necessary documentation. And most importantly, he had a cremation certificate. The body no longer existed, so there was no further investigation. The insurance companies were hesitant. Some paid faster, some slower. But in the end, they all paid out, because everything was technically in order. The official inquest ruled the death an accident. No charges were filed. There was no legal reason to deny payment. Larry got his millions. And here's the thing. He got them pretty quickly.
Within months of Bianca's death, he had almost $5 million extra in his accounts. For someone who had just lost his wife, Larry seemed very focused on financial matters, very efficient in securing insurance claims, very organized in getting all the necessary documents and forms. And here we come to what may have ultimately broken the case, the reaction of the people who really knew and loved Bianca. Bianca's friends were shocked, not just by her death, that would be natural, but the way it all played out, the speed of the cremation, Larry's behavior, and then the money. They started talking to each other. They shared their doubts. Some of them had known Bianca all their lives. They knew how strongly she believed. They knew she would never want to be cremated without a proper Catholic burial. They knew she wanted to be buried at home, surrounded by her loved ones. Friends also began to research insurance policies. How could there be so many? How could they be for such large sums? Did Bianca even know about it? Did she agree to it? Or were these policies taken out without her full knowledge of their extent? Questions began to circulate. Why was Larry in such a hurry to cremate her? Why had he ignored all their pleas to wait? Why hadn't he given Bianca's family and friends a chance to say goodbye? Why was he so focused on money so soon after the tragedy? Some friends began to actively investigate. They asked about the details of the trip to Zambia. They found out what Larry and Bianca's relationship was like in the months before her death. They talked to people who knew them. They tried to piece together a picture of what might have really happened. And the more they asked, the more inconsistencies they found. The story Larry was telling had too many holes. Too many things didn't make sense. Too many things looked suspicious. One of Bianca's closest friends finally made a decision that changed the whole case. He decided he couldn't just sit back and watch Larry walk away with millions while his girlfriend lay dead under circumstances that stunk to high heaven. This friend contacted the FBI. He told them about his doubts. He shared everything he knew with them. He described a quick cremation. He talked about insurance policies. He expressed his belief that Bianca's death was not an accident. And thus began a whole new chapter in this case. A chapter that would eventually lead to the discovery of the truth. Lori Milliron. That name became the key to the whole case. But who was Lori? And how did she get into Larry's life? Lori worked as a dental hygienist in Larry's Pittsburgh office. She was an attractive woman, professional in her work, someone who patients and colleagues alike found kind and competent. On the surface, she was a regular employee in a regular dental office. But behind closed doors, Lori was much more than just an employee. She was Larry's confidant. She was the one he confided in. She was the one he spent time with outside of work. And over time, she became something that fundamentally threatened Larry and Bianca's marriage. Lori wasn't just a work colleague. She knew Larry intimately. She knew his thoughts, his plans, his desires. She knew more about his marriage than any employee should know. And most importantly, she shared something with him that they were hiding from the world. She was the woman who saw Larry every day. She worked alongside him in his office. She assisted him in his procedures. She spent hours a day with him, often more time than his own wife. And in those hours, something developed between them that went far beyond a professional relationship. Lori was the one who understood Larry, or at least that's how Larry presented it. She was the one he could be himself with. She was a comfort, an excitement, something new in his otherwise run-of-the-mill life. A secret relationship that lasted for years. Now the shocking part. Larry and Lori had an affair that didn't last weeks or months. It lasted years, long years during which Larry lived a double life. Imagine the situation. Larry woke up in the morning next to Bianca, his wife. He had breakfast with her. Maybe they talked about their plans for the day. Then he went to work, and there was Lori waiting. They worked side by side all day, maintaining a professional facade in front of patients and other staff. But there was tension, secrecy, intimacy between them. In the evening, Larry would return home to Bianca. He told her about his day, but left out the essential details. He left out moments stolen with Lori. He left out the phone calls, the text messages, the touching, the glances they exchanged when they thought no one was looking. This double life lasted so long that it became the norm. Larry was a master at dividing his time, his attention, his emotions between two women. With Bianca, he had history, family, social status. With Lori, he had excitement, mystery, the idea of another life. How long exactly did their affair last? The evidence indicated it was at least years before Bianca's death. Some witnesses later testified that they noticed a change in Larry's behavior long before that he was often unavailable, that he had appointments that didn't make sense, that his explanations of where he was and what he was doing sometimes didn't add up. Larry and Lori were cautious. They couldn't afford to get caught. Larry had a lot to lose: his marriage, his reputation, maybe even some of his assets if the divorce went through. So their meetings were secret, planned, premeditated. They communicated by phone, but carefully. They met in places where no one knew them. They made excuses for why Larry had to be away from home: work conferences, dental seminars, visits to friends. Each lie was carefully constructed to look plausible. But here's the thing about secret relationships: they're unsustainable. The longer they last, the more complicated they get. And Larry and Lori began to think about more than just stolen moments. They started thinking about the future, plans for a life together. Larry and Lori didn't plan to stay a loving couple forever. They had a vision. They had dreams of what their lives could look like if they didn't have to hide anything. They talked about what it would be like to live together openly. They wouldn't have to hide. They wouldn't have to lie. They could be a normal couple who go to dinners, events, who don't have to worry about being seen together. Larry painted pictures of a future where he and Lori could travel, where they could enjoy his wealth together, where she wouldn't just be his employee, but his partner in every way. They talked about where they could live. Maybe they'd move somewhere where no one knew them, where they could start over without the burden of the past. Maybe they could have a house on the beach, or a luxury condo in the big city. The possibilities were endless, if Larry was single. And that was the problem. Larry wasn't single. He was married to Bianca. And Bianca showed no signs of wanting a divorce. She was happy with her life. Maybe she had no idea about Lori. Maybe she suspected, but she didn't want to face the truth. Either way, she wasn't planning on leaving her marriage. For Larry, divorce was complicated. He and Bianca shared property, the practice, investments, real estate. Divorce would mean splitting everything in half. Larry would have lost a significant portion of his fortune. And perhaps worse, divorce would damage his reputation. In their community, among their friends, in their social circles. So Larry and Lori looked for another way. They thought about how Larry could gain his freedom without divorce, how he could preserve his wealth and start a new life with Lori. And then there were the insurance policies. Those huge life insurance policies on Bianca. If something happened to Bianca, Larry would be single. He'd be rich, and he'd be free to start a new life with Lori. We don't know exactly when these conversations became concrete plans.
We don't know exactly when Larry started thinking about murder, but we do know that Lori knew about the insurance policies. She knew how much money Larry would get if Bianca died, and she knew that nothing would stand in the way of their future together. Lori's role in covering the trail. Lori wasn't just a passive lover waiting to see what would happen. She played an active role in what followed. After Bianca's death in Zambia, Lori was by Larry's side. She provided him with emotional support, or so it seemed on the outside. She was the one he confided in. She was the one who helped him through the tough times. But Lori did more than provide comfort. She was helping Larry keep his story consistent. When people started asking questions, Lori confirmed Larry's version of events. She told friends and acquaintances how devastated Larry was, how much he loved Bianca, how terrible the accident was. Lori also knew about the financial transactions. She helped Larry with the paperwork around the insurance claims.
As his confidant and close confidant, she had access to information that normally only family would know. And she used that access to make sure everything went smoothly. When Larry needed an alibi or an explanation for something he was doing before or after Bianca's death, Lori was there to back up his story. She claimed Larry was where he said he was. She confirmed his timelines. She testified about his character and how he could never do something like this. Lori also helped Larry create the image of a loving widower. She was discreet about their relationship. Outwardly, she remained a professional employee who was merely helping her boss through a difficult time. No one was supposed to know there was anything more between them, but behind closed doors, the reality was different. Lori and Larry were planning their future. They talked about how long they should wait before making their relationship public, how long the grieving period should last so it wouldn't look suspicious, when it would be appropriate to start being seen together publicly as a couple. Lori was also helping Larry spend the money. They traveled together. They bought things. They enjoyed the life they'd always imagined. And they did it all with the insurance money from Bianca's death. Financial motivation. And here we come to the heart of the matter. Money. The millions of dollars that stood between Larry and his freedom. $4,800,000. That's not just any amount. It's a sum that can completely change a life. It's a sum for which some people are willing to do unimaginable things. For Larry and Lori, this money represented the perfect future. Imagine what they could do with it. They could stop working if they wanted to. They could travel all over the world. They could buy the house of their dreams. They could live in luxury without worry. Larry was already a successful dentist. He was making good money. But this was different. This was money that would make him truly rich. Money that would give him complete financial freedom. And perhaps more importantly, he would get this money without having to go through a divorce. He wouldn't have to divide his assets with Bianca. He wouldn't have to pay alimony. He wouldn't have to argue about who gets what. Everything would stay his, plus millions in insurance money. For Lori, that money meant the ability to quit her job as a dental hygienist and live a life she could only dream of. No more getting up in the morning for work. No more brushing other people's teeth. Instead, a life alongside a wealthy man who could shower her with gifts and experiences. The financial motivation was clear and strong, and the longer Larry and Lori thought about the money, the more it seemed within their grasp. All that stood between them and those millions was Bianca. The fuses were closed. Larry was the beneficiary. Everything was in place. The only thing that had to happen was Bianca's death. And when the opportunity arose during a hunting expedition in remote Zambia, thousands of miles from home, where an investigation would be complicated, Was it too good an opportunity for Larry to pass up? Money motivates people to do incredible things. And in this case, money, along with the desire for a new life with Laurie, was the motive that led to murder. It's not every day the FBI gets notified of a suspicious death that happened on the other side of the world. But this announcement was different. It was urgent. It was detailed. And it came from someone who actually believed that a murder had occurred. The person who contacted the FBI wasn't just a casual acquaintance. It was someone who knew Bianca intimately. Someone who spent time with her, who understood her values, her beliefs, her way of thinking. And this person was absolutely convinced that what happened in Zambia was no accident. When this informant first called the FBI's Pittsburgh office, he had a list of reasons why he believed Bianca had been murdered. It wasn't an emotional outpouring without facts. It was a structured presentation of doubts and inconsistencies. The informant talked about Bianca's Catholic faith and how unimaginable it was that she would agree to be cremated. He talked about the speed with which Larry arranged everything. He talked about the insurance policies, the number and amount of them, which seemed unusually high. He talked about Larry's demeanor after his death, that he didn't seem truly devastated, but rather relieved. The informant also mentioned things he had learned about from other friends. There were whispers that Larry and Bianca's marriage was not as happy as Larry presented. Hints that Larry may have had someone else. Suspicions that Bianca might not even know about all the insurance policies on her life. The FBI agent who received the announcement took notes. He listened intently, and the more he listened, the more he realized that this wasn't just a paranoid friend seeing a conspiracy where there wasn't one. This was a legitimate suspicion based on concrete facts. The agent promised to look into the matter, that he would pass the information on, that the FBI would check to see if there was anything worthy of investigation. For the informant, that was all he could ask for, a chance to have someone with authority and resources look at the case objectively. And with that phone call, a new era of the Bianca Rudolph investigation began. The international investigation begins. The FBI has extensive powers, but investigating a murder that happened in Zambia presented unique challenges. They couldn't just send agents to Africa and start investigating. They had to respect international laws, diplomatic protocols, and the sovereignty of a foreign state. The first step was to contact the legal attaché at the US Embassy in Zambia. These attachés are actually the link between the US investigative authorities and the local authorities. Their job is to coordinate, facilitate cooperation, and ensure that investigations are conducted in accordance with international standards. The FBI also had to obtain all available documents from the Zambian investigation. Police reports, crime scene photographs, witness statements, autopsy reports, if any existed. Every scrap of paper, every photograph, every note could be crucial. And that's where the documentation done by the American consular officer came in handy. The photographs he took of Bianca's injuries before the cremation became invaluable evidence. The FBI now had visual documentation that allowed them to analyze the nature of the injuries, even though the body was long gone. The FBI also began charting Larry's movements before his trip to Zambia and after his return. When exactly did he leave? Who was he traveling with? What reservations did he make? How long had he been planning this trip? Were there any unusual purchases or activities in the weeks before he left? The agents began to build a timeline. Day by day, week by week, months by months, going back from the date of Bianca's death. They were looking for patterns. They looked for anomalies. They looked for anything that might indicate planning or preparation. International investigations require patience. Communication between countries takes time.
Documents have to be translated. Legal requirements of different jurisdictions must be met. It's not like investigating a domestic case where you can interview witnesses in hours. But the FBI has experience with cases like this. They have protocols. They have contacts all over the world. And most importantly, they have the resources and the tenacity to persevere, even when an investigation takes years. Working with the Zambian authorities. The Zambian police have already closed the case as an accident. For them, the matter was settled. But when the FBI started asking questions, Zambian authorities were willing to reopen communication. You have to understand the position of the Zambian authorities. They initially investigated the case with limited resources and under pressure from Larry, who wanted a quick closure. Now the FBI was coming in with new information, new questions, and the suggestion that maybe their original conclusion was wrong. For some Zambian officials, this could have been seen as a criticism of their work. But most police professionals, whether in Zambia or elsewhere, want to see justice done. If they have made a mistake, if they have overlooked something, they want to correct it. FBI agents have worked diplomatically. They did not try to take over the investigation. They didn't try to tell their Zambian colleagues what to do. Instead, they offered cooperation. They offered to share resources, expertise, technology. Zambian investigators gave the FBI access to all their records. They allowed them to re-interview key witnesses. They provided copies of all crime scene photos. They shared their notes and observations.
In return, the FBI gave their Zambian counterparts access to advanced forensic techniques. They offered ballistic analysis by top experts in the U.S. They shared profiles of similar cases where murders were disguised as weapons mishaps. A key moment was to re-interview the employees of the hunting farm. FBI agents, through Zambian colleagues, spoke with people who were present that day. They asked about details that the original investigation may not have considered important. What exactly did Larry look like when he was found with the body? Was he really wet or dressed? What exactly was he saying? How quickly did he arrive at the scene after being shot? Were there any inconsistencies in his behavior? Witnesses were interviewed again, this time with more detail. And their statements, especially the one from the employee who found Larry fully clothed, took on added significance. The FBI realized that this wasn't just a detail. It's crucial evidence that calls into question Larry's entire version of events. Zambian authorities also provided information about Larry's behavior in the days before Bianca's death. They spoke to the guides on the hunting trip. They asked about the dynamic between the couple. Did they seem happy? Were they arguing? Was there anything unusual in their interactions? Collecting evidence across continents. The FBI had to build a case that would stand up in an American court. That meant gathering evidence from many different sources and combining it into a coherent whole. Ballistics experts analyzed photographs of Bianca's injuries. They studied the angle of entry of the projectile. They calculated the distance from which the shot was likely fired. They compared the injuries to typical cases of accidental versus intentional gunshot wounds. Their findings were disturbing. The angle and distance of the shot did not match a scenario where Bianca herself was handling the gun. The shot looked more like something that was done by someone else holding the gun pointed at her. Financial investigators dug into Larry's financial records. They checked every insurance policy on Bianca's life. When were they taken out? Who signed them? Did Bianca know about all of them? Were there any changes in beneficiaries in the months before her death? They discovered a pattern that was interesting. Some of the policies were increased relatively recently before the trip to Zambia. Larry systematically built up the insurance coverage on Bianca's life, maximizing the amount he would receive in the event of her death. The digital forensics team analyzed Larry's computer, phone, email communications. They were looking for any sign of planning. They were looking for communications with Lori that might reveal their plans. They were looking for internet searches that might indicate preparation for murder. Even though Larry was careful, he left clues. Text messages between him and Lori that suggested an intimate relationship. Email communications about insurance policies. Searches for information about Zambia, about hunting accidents, about how death investigations work in foreign countries. The FBI also talked to the staff at Larry's office. Did they notice anything unusual about his behavior before the trip? Did he talk about the expedition? Did he seem nervous or excited? How did he act after he returned? Some staff members recalled that Larry seemed relaxed upon his return. Yes, he talked about the tragedy. Yes, he told a story about the accident. But he didn't seem as devastated as you'd expect from someone who'd just lost his wife. The FBI was also investigating insurance companies. How quickly did Larry file claims? Was there any urgency? Did he provide all the requested documents immediately, as if he had them ready? How did he respond to the insurance company's questions? Each piece of evidence was cataloged, analyzed, and included in a growing file. The FBI was building a mosaic. Each piece of evidence was like a small piece that might not say much on its own, but together they formed a clear picture. The time commitment of the investigation. Now for something that is often overlooked in TV crime dramas. Murder investigations are not quick, especially when it's an international case with complex evidence. The FBI worked on this case for over 5 years. 5 years! Imagine the tenacity, the dedication. The agents who began investigating this case devoted years of their professional lives to uncovering the truth about Bianca Rudolph's death. Why did it take so long? Because a good investigation can't be rushed. Every piece of evidence had to be carefully verified. Every statement had to be checked and double-checked. Every financial transaction had to be traced. The international aspect added another layer of complexity. It took months to obtain documents from Zambia. Coordinating with the Zambian authorities required patience and diplomatic skills. Every request for information had to go through official channels, which meant paperwork, waiting, and sometimes repeated requests. The FBI also had to be discreet. They couldn't simply arrest Larry on suspicion. They needed a solid case. They needed evidence that would convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. And building such a case takes time. During those years, Larry lived his life. He worked in his office. He spent time with Lori, spending his insurance money. Maybe he thought he got away with it. Maybe he believed he was safe after so many years without an arrest. But the FBI didn't give up. Agents kept working. They added new evidence to the file, solidifying their case. They consulted with prosecutors about when they would have enough evidence to indict. The investigation also involved surveillance. The FBI was monitoring Larry's activities. They were tracking his financial transactions, recorded his movements, documented his relationship with Lori, which became more and more open over time. A team of investigators met regularly to review progress. What have they got? What else do they need? What are the weaknesses in their case? Where could the defense attack? How can they strengthen their evidence? It was like putting together a giant jigsaw puzzle where some pieces were hidden on the other side of the world and others were buried in the depths of financial records or digital data. The moment of arrest. And then, in December 2021, the FBI decided it was time to act. After more than 5 years of investigation, they had a case they believed was strong enough. The arrest was coordinated. The FBI didn't want to risk Larry escaping if they got a pretext. The agents planned the operation to be quick and efficient. When the agents knocked on the door, Larry probably knew this moment had finally arrived. After all those years of living with the secret, After all those years of thinking he had escaped, justice had finally caught up with him. Larry Rudolph was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife, Bianca. He was also charged with insurance fraud. Finally, more than 5 years after that fatal wound in the Zambian hut, he was to stand trial. For Bianca's family and friends, it was a moment of relief mixed with pain. Finally, someone believed what they had known all along, that Bianca had been murdered. Finally, justice was about to be served. The courtroom was tense as the prosecution began to present their case. The prosecutors had a huge task ahead of them. They had to convince the jury that Larry Rudolph had killed his wife in cold blood in a remote African lodge. The first category of evidence the prosecution presented was detailed insurance documents. Prosecutors laid out before the jury the intricate web of life insurance policies Larry had taken out on Bianca's life. It wasn't just one policy. There were several, with different companies, with different closing dates. The prosecution showed how Larry systematically inflated the policy amounts. Some of the policies were old, but their value was being adjusted. Others were relatively recent. And what was particularly interesting, Larry himself signed many of the documents relating to these policies, often without Bianca being fully informed of the details. Insurance fraud experts testified about how unusual it was to have so many policies per person. They explained to the jury that while 1 or 2 life insurance policies were common for a high net worth couple, the quantity and value of the policies in this case was exceptional. It looked like someone was building a financial structure with a specific goal in mind. Another key category of evidence was the testimony from Zambia. The prosecution brought in witnesses, some in person, others by video link, who were present at the hunting farm on the day of Bianca's death. The most prominent was the farm employee who found Larry near Bianca's body. His testimony was devastating to the defense. He described exactly what Larry looked like: dressed, dry, nothing like someone who had just run out of the shower. He also described Larry's demeanor, surprisingly calm for someone who had supposedly just found his dead wife. This witness was thoroughly cross-examined by the defense, but his testimony remained consistent. He had no reason to lie. He had no contact with the family. He simply told what he saw on that fateful morning. Ballistics evidence was another crucial part of the prosecution's case. Ballistics experts analyzed photographs of Bianca's wounds taken before the cremation. These photographs were projected in the courtroom, difficult for the family to watch but essential for justice. The ballistics expert explained to the jury the angle of entry of the projectile. He showed, using models and diagrams, how the weapon would have to be held to cause such an injury. And his conclusion was clear. The injury did not fit a scenario where Bianca herself would have handled the weapon while packing. The expert demonstrated how it is nearly impossible for a shotgun to accidentally discharge in a normal packing situation. He explained the safety mechanisms on this type of weapon. He showed that a series of deliberate actions had to occur for the shot to fire: disengaging the safety, cock the hammer, pull the trigger. Then there was evidence of a relationship between Larry and Lori. Prosecutors introduced text messages that showed the intimate nature of their relationship. These weren't just professional messages between a boss and a female employee. They were messages full of personal content, tenderness, allusions to time spent together. The email correspondence revealed plans for the future, discussions about trips they might take, mentions of how nice it would be not to be tied down by the current situation. None of this was a direct admission of planning murder, but together it painted a picture of 2 people who longed for a life together and felt frustrated by the obstacles that existed. The staff at Larry's dental office testified to the dynamic between Larry and Lori. Some admitted to noticing something between them, although they could not name it at the time. They talked about how they spent more time together than would be normal, how they had frequent private conversations, how Lori had a special access to Larry that other employees didn't. Digital forensic evidence provided another layer of incriminating information. Digital forensics experts analyzed Larry's computer and phone. They found searches on Zambia, hunting trips, security protocols on international flights. Of particular interest, they also found searches related to insurance payouts and how long it typically takes to process an insurance claim in the event of a death abroad. Why would anyone search for such information before a trip if they weren't planning for a death to occur? The financial records showed how quickly Larry acted after Bianca's death.
Within days, he began filing insurance claims. He had all the necessary documents ready. He was efficient, organized, almost as if he had rehearsed the entire process in advance. The defense and its arguments. The defense had a difficult task ahead of them. She had to explain all this evidence and convince the jury that Larry was innocent. The defense's main strategy was to insist on the original version of events, that it was a tragic accident. The defense argued that gun accidents unfortunately happen more often than people think. They brought in their own experts who testified about hunting accident statistics. Their ballistics expert had a different perspective on injuries. He argued that the angle of the shot could be consistent with an accident if Bianca was holding the gun a certain way. He demonstrated various scenarios of how the accident could have occurred. But under cross-examination by the prosecution, this expert had problems. He had to admit that some of his theories required very specific and unlikely gun possession. He also had to admit that he did not have access to the body, so his conclusions were based only on photographs. Regarding insurance policies, the defense argued that wealthy people normally have high life insurance policies. Larry was a successful dentist. He had assets. He had liabilities. It was reasonable to have insurance coverage. The fact that the policies existed did not in itself prove intent to kill. The defense also attacked the timing. Some of the policies were taken out years before Bianca's death. If Larry was planning a murder, why would he wait so long? Why would he take out policies years in advance? Regarding the relationship with Lori, the defense admitted that there was something between them, but argued that it began after Bianca's death. They argued that Larry was vulnerable after the loss of his wife, and Lori provided him with emotional support that evolved into something more over time. However, this line of defense had a problem. There was evidence of intimate communication between Larry and Lori before the trip to Zambia. The dates on the emails and text messages undermined this defense. The defense also sought to impeach the Zambia witness. They pointed to language barriers, cultural differences, and possible misunderstanding of the situation. They argued that the witness may not have understood what he saw, or that his recollection may have been affected by time and repeated interrogations. But this witness stood his ground. His testimony was clear, detailed, and consistent across all interviews. He showed no signs of uncertainty or manipulation. He simply described what he saw. Defense attorneys also argued that the quick cremation was a practical decision, not an attempt to destroy evidence. Larry was in a foreign country, far from home, facing the complicated logistics of transporting a body. Cremation was a simpler solution, especially in the African climate. However, this argument alluded to the fact that Larry ignored Bianca's beliefs and the protests of her friends. To many members of the jury, this seemed less like a practical decision and more like a desperate effort to remove evidence. The prosecution proves premeditated murder. During the trial, prosecutors gradually built a narrative of premeditated murder. This was not a passionate murder in a moment of rage. It wasn't a random fight gone wrong. It was a carefully planned murder with a clear motive. The prosecution presented a timeline that showed Larry's preparation, closing and increasing insurance policies in the months and years before the murder, a developing relationship with Lori that created both emotional and financial motivation to eliminate Bianca. Prosecutors emphasized that Larry picked the perfect time and place, a remote hunting farm in Zambia,
thousands of miles from home. A country with limited forensic resources. A situation where a claim of a gun accident would be credible. The prosecution also pointed to Larry's behavior immediately after the murder. His insistence on a quick cremation. His efficiency in handling insurance claims. His relatively quick return to normal life. All of this was consistent with someone who executed a plan, not someone who was traumatized by the sudden loss of a loved one. Prosecutors created a narrative that tied all the evidence together. They showed the jury how each piece of the puzzle fit into the picture of a premeditated murder. The insurance policies provided a financial motive. Lori provided the emotional motive. The Zambian expedition provided opportunity. And Larry's actions after the murder showed a consciousness of guilt. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful. The prosecutor summarized all the evidence, pointed out the inconsistencies in Larry's story, emphasized the strength of the testimony. He asked the jury to do what was right, to convict Larry Rudolph of murdering his wife. Family dynamics during the trial. One of the most difficult aspects of the entire trial was the family dynamics. Larry and Bianca had children, and these children were forced to face the shocking possibility that their father had murdered their mother. At the beginning of the trial, the children stood behind their father. They sat in the courtroom on the defense side. They supported Larry with public statements. They believed his version of events, or at least they wanted to. The idea that their father could be a murderer was too horrible to accept. But as the trial went on and the evidence piled up, something began to change. The children heard testimony. They saw photographs. They read text messages between their father and Lori. They confronted a reality they could no longer ignore. There was a moment, no one knows exactly which piece of evidence it was, when something broke. Maybe it was the intimate messages between Larry and Lori. Maybe it was a ballistics analysis. Maybe it was the cumulative weight of all the evidence together. The children began to see their father through a different lens. The man they'd known all their lives, the man they loved and trusted. Maybe he wasn't who he said he was. Maybe he was capable of something unimaginable. As the trial progressed, the children stopped appearing for the defense. Their public support ceased. Some reports suggested that they began to communicate with the prosecution, that they wanted to hear the whole truth without the defense's filters. It was a double tragedy for these children. First, they lost their mother in horrific circumstances. Then they were forced to face the possibility that their own father had murdered her. And finally, they had to accept this terrible truth and confront the man who raised them. Bianca's friends were also in the courtroom. People who knew her, loved her, and who believed from the beginning that she was murdered. For them, the trial was a confirmation of their suspicions, but also a painful confrontation with the details of her end. Some of these friends testified. They spoke of Bianca's character, her faith, her values. They helped the jury see Bianca not just as a victim, but as a real person with a life, dreams, and people who loved her. Prosecutors often emphasized the human side of the case. It wasn't just a collection of evidence and legal arguments. This was a real woman who was killed, a real family that was destroyed, real lives that were changed forever. When the jury retired for deliberations, the entire courtroom waited in suspense. Family, friends, lawyers, reporters all waited for the verdict that would determine whether Larry Rudolph would spend the rest of his life in prison or walk away a free man. As the jury delivered its verdict, the sound of a pin dropping could be heard in the courtroom. Guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of insurance fraud. Larry Rudolph, a successful Pittsburgh dentist, was officially convicted of killing his wife. But the verdict was just the beginning. Now came the punishment, and the judge had a tough decision to make. How to punish a man who had cold-bloodedly planned and executed the murder of his own wife for money and a new wife. In July of the year 2022, the judge sat for sentencing. The courtroom was packed. Family, friends, the media, all waiting for this decision. Larry sat at the defense table, perhaps for the first time actually looking nervous. Up until now, he had maintained the pose of an innocent man. But now, as he awaited the verdict, the reality of his situation was undeniable. The judge first made a statement. He spoke of the seriousness of the crime. He spoke of how Larry had abused his wife's trust, how he had taken her on a trip where she felt safe and then murdered her there. He talked about the premeditated nature of the crime, how Larry carefully planned, how he manipulated the situation, how he tried to avoid justice. The judge also talked about the impact on the family, the children who have lost not only their mother, but now their father. About Bianca's friends, who had to live for years knowing that their friend had been murdered while the killer lived free. About a system that was almost fooled if not for the persistence of those who sought the truth. Then came the verdict itself. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Larry Rudolph would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He'll never walk free. He'll never reap the millions he made by murdering his wife. He'll never have the free life with Lori that he dreamed of. Life without parole is one of the harshest sentences in the American legal system, second only to the death penalty. It means Larry will die in prison. He could be 20 years old, he could be 80. It doesn't matter. His last days will be spent in a cell. When the judge handed down the sentence, Larry didn't react dramatically. There was no outburst of emotion, no screaming or crying. He just sat there, perhaps in shock, perhaps resigned to his fate. Officials led him from the courtroom in handcuffs, and that was the last time Larry Rudolph saw the world outside the prison walls as a free man. For Bianca's family and friends, the verdict was a mixed bag. Yes, justice had been served. Yes, Larry would pay for what he had done. But no sentence will bring Bianca back. No punishment will make the pain of her loss go away. Justice was served, but at a price no one wanted to pay. Larry was transferred to a high-security federal prison where he will spend the rest of his days. His prison life is a far cry from the luxury he was used to. No more hunting expeditions, no dental work, no millions in the bank account. Just a cell, a prison routine, and the knowledge that this is where his life will end. Lori Milliron and her punishment. But Larry wasn't the only one facing justice. Lori Milliron, the woman who was his mistress and accomplice, also stood trial. Lori was charged with being an accessory and perjury. The prosecution claimed that Lori knew of Larry's plan, that she helped him both before and after the murder, and that she lied to investigators to protect him. The evidence against Lori was complex. Communications between her and Larry showed that she knew about the insurance policies. She knew about the financial details. They talked about the future they could have if Larry was free. And after Bianca's death, Lori actively helped Larry create the coverage. Lori gave false statements to investigators. She claimed that her relationship with Larry was purely professional until after Bianca's death. She denied knowing the extent of the policies. She claimed that Larry was devastated by his wife's death and that he would never have been capable of murder. All of these statements were later contradicted by the evidence. Text messages, email correspondence, witness statements, all showed that Lori was lying. And lying to federal agents in an investigation is itself a federal crime. Lori also tried to influence witnesses. She contacted some of the office staff and tried to get them to give correct recollections of events. She tried to coordinate the stories to support Larry's version of events. When it came time for her trial, Lori had the option of cooperating with the prosecution in exchange for a lighter sentence. She could testify against Larry, admit her role, provide details of what she knew and when she knew it. But Lori refused. She remained loyal to Larry to the end, but that loyalty didn't help her. The jury found her guilty. And in July of 2022, the same time period as Larry, Lori was awaiting her verdict. The judge was tough on Lori, but not as tough as he was on Larry. He acknowledged that her role was supportive, not direct. She wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. She wasn't the one who physically killed Bianca. But she was an accomplice. She was part of the conspiracy, and she helped cover up the crime. Lori Milliron's sentence was 17 years in federal prison. 17 years. That's not a life sentence like Larry's, but for a woman her age, it means losing a significant part of the rest of her life. 17 years in federal prison means Lori will come out an old woman. Her career is ruined. Her relationship with Larry is over. They will be in prison far apart with no contact. All those dreams of a life of luxury with Larry's money are gone. For Lori, the punishment has been devastating. Weeping in the courtroom, she may have finally understood the extent of her mistake. She may have realized that love, or what she thought was love, had cost her everything. Her freedom, her future, her life. Lori was also transferred to federal prison, where she began serving her sentence. Unlike Larry, she has a release date. It will be in 17 years if she behaves in an exemplary manner. But even if she gets out, what's in store for her? No career, no family, no Larry. Just the memories of how greed and bad decisions ruined her life. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part of the entire epilogue is what happened to Larry and Bianca's children. These children have been through something that no one can imagine. First, they lost their mother. That in itself is a traumatic experience. But then they had to face the possibility, and ultimately the reality, that their own father was the one who killed her. Imagine the psychological burden. Imagine the questions they must have had. How do you process something like that? The children originally stood by their father. It was natural. It was their family, their daddy. They wanted to believe in his innocence because the alternative was too horrible. But as the evidence piled up, as the truth came out, they had to face reality. The moment the children turned on their father was not public and dramatic. There was no official statement, but those who followed the case noticed. The children stopped going to court. They stopped making supportive statements. Their silence spoke volumes. After the verdict, some of the children spoke out. They talked about their loss, not just the loss of their mother, but the loss of both parents. The mother was dead. The father was a murderer who would spend the rest of his life in prison. For the children, that meant orphanhood, even though technically their father was still alive. The children also had to face the financial consequences. The insurance money, the millions their mother died for, was confiscated. They were the proceeds of crime, so the state confiscated them. The children didn't get any of that money, which was ironic. Their mother died for money that no one in the family ended up getting. The family also had to deal with public shame. The case was widely publicized. Rudolph's name was all over the news, associated with murder, betrayal, greed. The kids had to live with that stigma, knowing that anyone could Google their last name and find the whole horrible story. Some kids sought therapy. How could they not? The trauma they experienced required professional help. They had to learn to live with what had happened. They had to find a way to forgive. Not necessarily their father, but themselves for trusting him in the first place. Bianca's friends became a kind of surrogate support system for the children. These people who had loved their mother and fought for justice were now helping her children cope with the aftermath. They provided emotional support, practical help, a reminder of what their mother was really like. It was also hard for the children to come to terms with the image of their father. They remembered him as the dad who raised them, who spent time with them, who taught them things. But now they had to reconcile that memory with the reality of the man who murdered their mother. How can you love and hate the same person at the same time? Some psychologists who specialize in family trauma have spoken of this case as an extreme example of family betrayal. The children didn't just lose their parents, they lost their trust, their innocence, their sense of security in the world. Justice after 6 years. Nearly 6 years passed between that fateful morning in the Zambian hut and the moment the verdict was delivered. 6 years of waiting. 6 years during which Larry had lived free, enjoyed the money he'd earned from the murder, planned a future with Lori. For those who believed in Bianca's innocence from the beginning, those 6 years were frustrating. They watched Larry live his life while their friend lay in her grave. They watched him spend money that had been bought with her blood. They saw how it seemed that justice might never come. But justice did arrive, slowly but surely. The FBI didn't give up, the prosecutors persevered, and finally, after 6 years, Larry Rudolph was where he belonged, behind bars. 6 years may sound like a long time, but in the context of an international murder investigation, it's actually not that unusual. A good case takes time. Evidence must be collected, analyzed, verified. Witnesses must be interviewed, double-checked. Legal procedures must be followed. And in this case, waiting served a purpose. When the trial finally came, the case was so strong that the jury didn't need long to decide. All those years of investigation had built an undeniable case against Larry. For Bianca's family and friends, the verdict was a relief. They could finally begin the process of real grieving. When a killer lives free, it's hard to close the chapter. But now, with Larry in prison for life, they could begin to heal. Justice also meant something important to the larger society. It sent the message that even if you commit a crime on the other side of the world, even if you manage to fool the local authorities, the truth will eventually come out. That the persistence of investigators and the courage of those who seek the truth can overcome even the most carefully planned crimes. The case of Bianca Rudolph has become a study. It is taught in law schools as an example of international investigation. It is used in FBI training as an example of persistent and methodical case building. It serves as a reminder that murder is not a perfect crime, even though it may seem that way for a while. For Bianca herself, justice came too late. It could not resurrect her. But her memory has been cleansed. Everyone now knew she hadn't been careless with the gun, that it wasn't her fault, that she had been the victim of someone's greed and betrayal. And her name would be remembered not as a woman who died in a stupid accident, but as a woman who was murdered and whose killer was finally brought to justice. And now that we have gone through this whole shocking case, it is time to reflect on what this story teaches us and what lessons we can take away from it. The importance of perseverance in investigations. When I look at this case, one of the most important lessons is the absolute importance of perseverance. You see, nowadays we are used to quick fixes. We watch crime shows where the case is solved in 45 minutes, including commercials. But the reality is very different. Perseverance means not giving up even when the case seems dead. It means continuing to investigate even when the public has long forgotten. It means believing that the truth is out there, even when it's buried under layers of lies and manipulation. In this case, it would be so easy for investigators to just give up. The Zambian police classified it as an accident. The body was cremated. The prime suspect was a wealthy man with good lawyers. Most of the physical evidence was destroyed. Why bother? But the people working the case didn't follow what was easy. They went with what was right. Day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, they picked up small pieces of the mosaic. One email here, one statement there, one financial record here. Persistence also means resisting pressure. Larry had money for good lawyers who could create legal obstacles. He had a social standing that gave him a certain amount of respect. He had time on his side. The longer the investigation took, the more people could forget, the more evidence could disappear. But the investigators persevered, and their persistence paid off. They proved that even the most cleverly planned crimes can be solved if there is someone willing to devote time and energy to finding the truth. This lesson applies not only to investigators, it applies to anyone who seeks justice. For the families of victims who refuse to accept easy answers, for friends who know something's not right, for anyone who believes the truth should be revealed, no matter how long it takes. Persistence requires sacrifice. Investigators have spent years of their careers on this case. They could have worked on other cases that would have been quicker, easier, with more immediate results. But they chose to persevere, and their choice meant the difference between the killer remaining free and being brought to justice. International cooperation in justice. Another fascinating aspect of this case is the level of international cooperation that was required to solve it. We live in a globalized world where crimes often cross borders, and justice must be able to cross those borders as well. The cooperation between American and Zambian authorities was not a given. These are two very different countries with different legal systems, different resources, different cultural contexts. The Zambian authorities may have felt that their sovereignty was threatened when America began to question their conclusions. But instead of opposing each other, the two countries found a way to work together. Zambian investigators provided access to evidence. American authorities shared their expertise and resources. Together, they formed a team that overcame geographic and cultural barriers. This collaboration shows how modern justice must work. Criminals take advantage of globalization, traveling between countries, exploiting differences in legal systems, looking for loopholes to slip through. If justice has a chance, it must be equally global. Diplomatic channels have played a key role. Legal attachés, consular officers, international mutual legal assistance agreements. All these tools have been used to allow investigations to proceed across continents. The lesson for the future is clear. Investment in international judicial cooperation is not a luxury. It is a necessity. When countries share information, when investigators can communicate across borders, when legal systems can work together, criminals have fewer places to hide. This case also shows the importance of respect in international cooperation. American investigators did not come with an attitude of superiority. They did not come to tell their Zambian colleagues that they had made a mistake. They came with respect, with an offer of cooperation, with the recognition that each side has something to offer. This respect created an environment where cooperation could flourish. The Zambian authorities were willing to reopen the case because they did not feel that they were being criticized, but that they were being invited to partner. And this partnership eventually led to justice. Money as a motive for murder. As I reflect on this case, I cannot help but return to the underlying motive: money. It is a classic motive, as old as human civilization itself. But it never ceases to shock how far some people are willing to go for financial gain. Greed is a powerful force. It can blind people to morality, to love, to humanity. In Larry's case, greed overcame decades of marriage. It overcame the memories of a life spent together. It overcame any sense of right and wrong. What's particularly disturbing about this case is the systematic nature of Larry's planning. It wasn't just money, it was a huge amount of money. And it wasn't an impulsive decision. It was a carefully constructed plan that may have taken years. Taking out the policies, increasing their value, ensuring that he was the sole beneficiary. All of this took time and planning. Every signature on the insurance policy was a step closer to murder. Every increase in value was more motivation to execute the plan. And then there's the question: how much is enough? Larry had already been successful. He had a good career, a decent income, a comfortable life. He wasn't a poor man who desperately needed money to survive. He was a wealthy man who wanted to be even wealthier. This lesson about greed is a warning to us all. It's not just a warning about murder. That's an extreme that most people will never reach. But it is a warning about how the desire for money can distort our values, our priorities, our relationships. How many relationships are destroyed because of money? How many families are broken up over inheritances? How many friendships end because of financial disputes? Murder is an extreme manifestation of this problem, but the roots are the same. Greed overriding love and respect for others. The case also shows how money can motivate not only the direct perpetrator, but those around him. Lori was not the one who pulled the trigger, but she was motivated by the same vision of wealth. She was willing to be part of the conspiracy, to lie, to cover up the crime, all for the idea of a life of luxury. The loss of both parents for the children. Of this whole tragic story, perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect is what happened to the children. And there is a lesson here that goes beyond this particular case. Crime never just affects the victim. It ripples outward and affects innocent people, often the most vulnerable. These children woke up one day to a world where they had both parents. Then their mother died.
Then they found out their father was her killer. How do you process something like that? How do you ever recover from that? Losing a mother is a traumatic event for any child, no matter what age. But losing your mother and then finding out your own father murdered her? That's trauma on a whole other level. It's a betrayal so deep that it erodes your ability to trust anyone. Children have not only lost their parents, they've lost their innocence. They've had to face the dark side of human nature in a way that most people will never experience. They had to accept that someone they loved and trusted was capable of something unimaginable. This lesson is a reminder that when we think about punishment, we need to think not only about the perpetrator and the victim, but also about everyone else who is affected. The children in this case are victims just like their mother, just in a different way. There is also a lesson here about the importance of support for such children. They need therapy, understanding, people to help them process what has happened. Society has a responsibility to provide that support because these children have done nothing wrong, yet they carry a heavy burden. The power of those who seek the truth. The last big lesson from this case is about the power of individuals who refuse to accept a lie. This case may never have been solved if Bianca's friends had simply accepted the official version and moved on. But they didn't. They saw the inconsistencies. They felt something was wrong. And most importantly, they had the courage to act on their suspicions. Contacting the FBI is no small thing. It means standing up to a powerful man, risking being wrong, facing possible ridicule or legal trouble. But these friends did it because they knew it was the right thing to do. Their love for Bianca and their desire for justice was stronger than their fear or comfort. This is a lesson for all of us. When you see something that isn't right, when you suspect injustice is happening, speak up. Yes, it can be uncomfortable. Yes, you may face resistance. But your voice can be the difference between the truth being exposed and remaining buried. In this day and age when there is so much cynicism and apathy, this case is a reminder that individuals can make a difference. One phone call to the FBI changed the course of this case. One person who had the courage to speak up set off a chain of events that led to justice. There is also a lesson here about community responsibility. Bianca's friends supported each other. They shared their doubts. They strengthened each other in their search for truth. They weren't isolated individuals. They were people united by a common purpose. This strength of community is important. When you're up against a powerful opponent, it's easy to feel alone and powerless. But when you have others around you who share your beliefs, your hopes, your determination, you become much stronger.
Final thoughts. And that brings us to the conclusion of this incredible story. The Bianca Rudolph case is a story of betrayal, greed, and murder. But it is also a story of perseverance, justice, and the power of truth. Bianca Rudolph was a real person with a life, dreams, and people who loved her. She wasn't just a statistic or a headline. She was a wife, a mother, a friend, a community member, and she deserved justice. That justice came, even if it took years. It came because of the persistence of investigators, the courage of friends, international cooperation, and a system that ultimately worked as it should. For those of you who have watched this video to the end, I hope this story has given you something to think about. You may have learned something about investigating crimes. Maybe you gained insight into human psychology. Maybe you simply heard a fascinating story. But most of all, I hope you take away this. Truth has value. Justice matters. And each of us has a role in ensuring that both are upheld. Thank you for being here with me today. If you're interested in this case, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell because I have more cases like this coming up. Let me know in the comments what you think about this case and what case I should discuss next. And remember, the truth always finds its way to the light. Sometimes it just takes longer than we'd like. See you in the next video. Bye, guys.